Hi, everybody. So this is the first new genre that we're getting aside from pop and folk music. We're getting blues music, and we're going to look at two little kind of subgenres within that: vaudeville blues and country blues. The country blues is probably the earlier form, which emerges probably around 1900. But it's useful to understand that we don't even get any blues recordings until 1920 at the very earliest. At least blues recordings from Black musicians, people who are actually making this music. And a lot of the country blues that we have is actually from the late 1920s, 1930s. So the music gets recorded later, even though it's really flourishing around the year 1900. Its origins lie in the rural American South and small towns, little clubs and things like that. But a lot of this is born out of that folk music tradition. The audio of these songs is going to be usually a solo vocalist with a guitar. In terms of country blues, that's pretty much what it always is, maybe a harmonica. The vaudeville blues that we'll look at often has a piano or a horn or a combo ensemble of some kind. In terms of the purpose, all of this music is really personal for the performers, right? They're playing it for themselves. And then as time goes on, they're busking, right? They're street musicians. They're doing it in these little vaudeville theaters that we'll look at. So it becomes something performative. But originally, it really is just singing the blues is really for personal recreation. A lot of the subject matters are challenging life conditions, right? You don't get the name blues unless it really has that meaning. Sometimes it's about romance, but usually it's a romance gone wrong. So there is that sad little part of it. The overview, right? We're always going to do historical context, some of the audio elements, musicians and songs to know. I will just tell you, it was really hard to narrow down the songs to know because some of this music is just so amazing. In terms of the big context, right, big picture, I'm going to talk about this map here in just a second. I'll show you a bigger version. Black Americans are being restricted economically, politically, socially throughout the United States during this time period, but particularly in the South. And we call this era the Jim Crow era, named after that minstrel character we looked at previously. And we do that because it's designed to keep Black people in a state of near enslavement, right? Even though slavery in the United States technically ends in 1865, we know that the justice system is recreating slavery all across the American South. These huge prison farms are emerging. And we know that this situation is not something that is going to go away anytime soon, right? It exists in the United States for decades and decades. Around the year 1900, right, we're starting to see Southern Black musicians working in nightclubs. We're seeing them busking on the street in cities like Dallas and New Orleans and Memphis and Houston. And they're doing these, sometimes they're traveling from town to town doing this. They're performing hybrid music of spirituals and folk songs and work songs and murder ballads. And they're performing all of this in this style that emerges and becomes called country blues, right? It's called country, not in the sense of country western music that we'll look at soon, but because it comes out of the rural life. Around 1910 or so, we start to see vaudeville shows begin featuring Black singers performing country blues tunes or possibly Tin Pan Alley songs in novel ways. And originally, a lot of these were cabaret shows, right? They're designed to be titillating. They're designed to bring in, men who are going to watch sort of like a strip club, but not quite. So vaudeville kind of had a range, right? Where, on one level it was family friendly, and then there were some that weren't quite family friendly. And in that range, right, we start to see some Black singers and performers entering the vaudeville shows and playing this music that becomes called vaudeville blues. So, and I will get back to that map in a second. I'm not sure. Here it is. Here's the map. And I'll change the order of the slides here. This map really shows why this is happening. There's something called the Great Migration going on. And it starts around 1910, really accelerates during World War I, where the United States enters the war in 1917. And it continues all through the 1960s. For these 5 decades or so, Black Americans were moving en masse out of the South, trying to escape the suffocating political and social environment of segregation, of limited economic opportunity, right, of the constant threat of being imprisoned or murdered with extrajudicial and judicial violence. So we see these waves of people moving out, millions of people, and the sound of their music moved with them. And that's where we're starting to see people, particularly in cities like St. Louis and Chicago and New York City and Kansas City, they're hearing this music for the first time, and they're writing it down and making sheet music and that sort of thing. Wanted to show you some images of vaudeville theaters. So vaudeville, and this is kind of something we don't, modern times we aren't as familiar with, they would be these shows that could range from these tiny little hole-in-the-wall theaters, maybe with 50 people or so, all the way up to thousands of people. And they would be variety shows where, you know, you'd have a skit that's supposed to be funny, and then you have another, you know, 10 or 15-minute skit that's really sad and it's designed to pull at your emotions. You might have jugglers and circus performers, and then you might have a cabaret show with someone dancing kind of sexually. You know, they're never going to be totally, you know, like a strip club. That's not what these things are. But they're more like entertaining the masses. And so they would run continuously throughout the day, and you would just pay your nickel. Here's continuous vaudeville right there. And you'd pay your nickel and you could come in and sit and watch the entertainment. So they're designed really for mass entertainment in an era before radio, before television, right? Before even movies were around. There are still vaudeville theaters. A lot of them got converted into movie theaters and then later on into performance venues. So here in St. Louis, where I'm from, we have a symphony hall called Powell Symphony Hall. This is what it is on the outside, and this is the interior. And it was a vaudeville theater originally, a massive palace of a vaudeville theater, but a vaudeville theater all the same. So we kind of have talked about that distinction here, a little bit more about the musicians. They're almost always adults. And in terms of classic blues, which is what vaudeville and country blues are, they're always black. They're usually poor. They're usually born and or living in the South. Some of them move out of the South as part of the Great Migration. Country blues, and this is an interesting distinction here, country blues is almost always black men, vaudeville blues is almost always black women. And that's partially because thinking about who's going to vaudeville shows, right? And if it's, you know, if it's white audiences that are paying for entertainment, a lot of times they're looking for a little bit of kind of the edge, right? So these think about like a 40-year-old white guy, he's going to go and watch a vaudeville show. He doesn't really want to see a 40-year-old black guy. He's going to see a woman. Audiences for these things are usually similar, you know, lower class, young black adults. By the 1920s and 10s, the vaudeville shows are pulling in white people as well. So I should probably have added that part here. The vaudeville theaters, especially with these black female performers, are attracting white audiences, although it's still kind of risque, right? You know, it's not polite society by any means to go watch one of these things. And there is a distinction between who's going to see country blues and who's going to see vaudeville. Vaudeville is mass entertainment for middle class kind of folks, sometimes clubs for dancing and things. Country blues is really for the rural, the lowest rung on the social ladder, right? The subject matters are romance and sex and murder and work and just, you know, the depressingness of grinding poverty, the desire to go to a new city. It's really powerful music. One thing I should mention here in maybe this context is there's a guy named W.C. Handy, and there's a black man here in the corner. He is called the father of the blues, not because he necessarily wrote all the blues music or any of that. He's really well known because he's one of the first to write blues sheet music, right? Write it out and publish it. And so some of his most famous compositions are things like the St. Louis Blues, which is part of our song analysis guide. So we already took a look at the Great Migration, and here in this map again, it's called the Great Blues Migration, because we start to see these styles of the blues, like Texas blues and Delta blues, going out into the rest of the United States. This is a good little clip that's about what is the blues, right? If you're not sure, if you're still like, you know, what's it about? Studs Terkel, a really famous historian and oral history interviewer, he asked Bill Brunzi, which is the gentleman here in the corner, a classic, you know, country blues artist, what's the blues? And Big Bill Brunzi said, real blues, you don't mix it with nothing. You just play the blues. Real blues, Mississippi blues, the Delta. You just change chords when you feel like it, and you play what you feel. And the Smithsonian here wrote, the country blues is the music of day-to-day life. It's the lonely music of lounging on the front porch, the rowdy music of a house party, the raucous, engaging music. They deal with the African-American experience, the hardships of work, life, and love in the South, and travel and loneliness and the wandering. And so you'll get that in a lot of these songs. They're pretty powerful stuff. In terms of audio, country blues is almost always a solo vocalist with a guitar or a harmonica. They almost never play in groups. They typically are not amplified, so they're an acoustic guitar. And again, that reflects the technology of the time. In 1910, in 1920, even in 1930, when you could get, some early electrical amplification, they aren't doing that. And by 1940, even, we start to see technology changing it. We'll look at what that looks like later. In terms of vaudeville blues, it's usually the solo vocalist, it's a black female, and it's going to have an ensemble, maybe a piano, a horn, a harmonium, which is kind of an organ. You might have a violin, depending on how nice the vaudeville theater was. In the recordings, we often get, a few instruments, maybe a combo. That down there in the corner is a picture of Mamie Smith, a really famous vaudeville blues musician, and her ensemble. The vocals can be raspy, they be gravelly, almost nasal. The instruments themselves can be really kind of sharp. Partly that's because of the recording technology of the sounds of the time. Partly it's because of the instruments they were choosing, right? Harmonica is pretty sharp. Guitar can be quite sharp. Tempo, oftentimes the earlier music is slower, and that's because it's born out of this folk music tradition. Later on, when it becomes popular in nightclubs and bars, they speed it up a little for dancing, and it's more, raucous and exciting. You'll also notice that the pitch of the singers is usually on the high range. Even for the men, it's pretty high. Vibrato and even yodeling is common. The yodeling comes out of a really massive phenomena in the 1920s of really popular singers who would yodel some of their notes. So you'll pick up some of that, and occasionally you'll notice it. They also backstretch notes, which means that you would normally sing the notes along with a particular chorus or stanza or a verse of a song. Sometimes they'll stretch the notes beyond the chorus, the stanza, or they'll start them beforehand, and it kind of provides a little bit more excitement to the songs. This is a little bit more zoomed in picture. You can see, we've got a fiddle, we've got some horns, and we've got Mamie Smith here at front and center and all of that. Musicians. The musicians are usually going to be performers and composers, although a lot of times the performers are also pulling in folk songs. They're pulling in traditional ballads, and that even sometimes vaudeville blues are songs that are Tin Pan Alley songs, right? So they're all over the place, although the country blues artists are usually kind of traditional, or they're writing their own. First, let's start with vaudeville. Here's 5 pictures of kind of the 5 first ladies of vaudeville blues. Mamie Smith, which we saw a photo of her. This is her kind of right at the peak of her popularity. You can see there kind of with this fancy looking outfit on and her hair done, and just a really beautiful picture. Ma Rainey is an older woman here, similar though. She's got the pearls, she's got her hair done up. Lucille Bogan is another one of this era. You can see the furs. Bessie Smith, a later singer, a little bit, in terms of popular later, she tragically dies in a car accident, really at the peak of her fame in the 1930s. And then there in the corner is Alberta Hunter, who is the longest lived of maybe these early vaudeville blues artists. I'll mention a story about Alberta Hunter. She basically performed until the 1930s, 40s, and then fell off the map. And then in the late 1970s, she was like, I'm going to come back into it. And she had this enormous comeback in her 80s, right? And she's a pretty famous cultural icon of that era. She also was a pretty well-known lesbian, as was Lucille Bogan. So some of these singers, and Ma Rainey and some of these others, especially the vaudeville blues female singers, a lot of them are LGBTQ icons, because they're kind of straddling the line between the heteronormative reality of the 1920s and 30s and these desires that are who they are. So Alberta Hunter did get married, but she actually never consummated that relationship, and it was mainly because she needed somebody who they wouldn't accuse her of being gay. In terms of country blues, Charlie Patton is probably considered the father of country blues. There aren't any photos of Charlie Patton because he died in the 1930s before he even became popular. He had some recording sessions, but he is salt of the earth. He actually learned his playing style from a man named Henry Sloan. We don't even have any recordings of him. Some of these later guys, Robert Johnson, Blind Lemon Jefferson, Sunhouse Leadbelly. This is Leadbelly later afterwards. We talked about him before. He was in prison when he first was discovered. Becomes a really popular, well-known folk artist and blues artist. Blind Lemon Jefferson actually starts out as a religious man and singing religious songs, and then he transitions into this blues artist. Pretty popular in the 1930s. This is Son House. He was also a preacher, and then switched over and started singing the blues. He was not super popular in the 1920s and 30s during this peak era, but by the 1960s, he became this giant. And that's partially because, as you can see, many of these folks are dying young. Charlie Patton dies of something called a heart valve malfunction. They aren't really sure what killed him. Some of these others die of heart attacks and things like that. Blind Lemon Jefferson dies as well early. Robert Johnson is probably the most famous of all of the country blues artists. He has got the coolest life story of them all. I really encourage you to check him out. 3 songs to know. And again, this was super hard for me because there's so many great songs from these genres. Crazy Blues, you got to know. It's the first real blues song that's recorded. It's released in 1920 and it becomes a huge success. Before 1920, record companies did not try to sell records to black people. It would just, they viewed it as like, why would I do that? Black families can't afford the records. They don't understand them, right? All of these stereotypes of these people of that era. And a producer took a chance with Mamie Smith, who was a pretty well-known vaudeville singer of the era, and it just became a massive hit. You can hear this powerful emotion. She's heartbroken. She's angry. She even threatens to shoot a cop in this song. She talks about using drugs. It's an intense song. What a great vaudeville blues song. Sweet Home Chicago, a different song, a different genre, right? We've got country blues now. Robert Johnson here, shortly before his death, singing about the desire to move to a better place, right? It's really about the Great Migration. It doesn't call it that, but that's what it is. He doesn't probably write the melody, which is from other songs, but he's adapting it, and he's really creating a classic song here. Duncan and Brady, one of my favorites because it's a murder ballad and it's a true story, and it's such an intense song. It's a ride. It's about a black bartender named Duncan, and you can go look this up. Duncan was a black man living in St. Louis running a bar, and a white policeman came in St. Louis, and they got into an argument. The policeman was trying to shut down a poker game, possibly. We're not sure. Maybe he was looking for a bribe. And Duncan shot him and killed him. This song is fascinating because it's the story of murder ballad, but it's also a great example of country blues. So I hope you get to check it out. There's a couple other great country blues murder ballads. Frankie and Johnny is another one. Stagger Lee, which is just amazing. All 3 of those, Frankie and Johnny, Duncan and Brady, and Stagger Lee, are all murder ballads. They're all true stories, and they all happen within a few years in St. Louis. So, this is a pretty cool genre to think about. Hopefully, if you're in class, we'll check out this Vaudeville and Country Blues Song Analysis Guide. There's tons of great resources out there I encourage you to check out. Hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.